He marketplace on station, buzzed with the usual cacophony of a dozen different species conducting business. Sarah Chen adjusted the weight of her grocery bags while her 8-year-old son Marcus tugged at her sleeve, pointing excitedly at a vendor selling crystalline formations that chimed when touched. The station served as a neutral trading post between the Galactic Federation worlds, and Sarah had called it home for 3 years now since her husband's death in a mining accident. "Mom, can we get one of those singing crystals?" Marcus asked, his dark eyes wide with wonder. "Maybe next week, sweetheart. We need to stick to our budget," Sarah replied, though she made a mental note of the vendor's location. Marcus had been through enough changes lately, and small joys meant everything. As they walked toward the transit hub, a commotion near the waste disposal units caught Sarah's attention. A group of Zelithian merchants, their scaled hides glistening under the artificial lighting, had formed a circle around something small and cowering. The Zelithians were known throughout the galaxy for their ruthless business practices and superiority complex, believing themselves to be the pinnacle of evolution. "Look at this pathetic thing," one of them hissed, his forked tongue flicking out in disgust. "Can barely lift a standard cargo unit. What use is a Vorthak youngling if it cannot even perform basic labor?" Sarah stepped closer, her protective instincts immediately activated. In the center of the circle sat a small creature that couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 years old in human terms. The youngling had large, luminous purple eyes filled with tears and delicate silver skin that seemed to shimmer despite being covered in grime. Her species, the Vorthaks, were known for their exceptional psychic abilities, but this little one looked terrified and alone. "The labor contracts clearly state that purchased workers must meet minimum strength requirements," another Zelithian continued, towering over the small figure. "This one is defective. We demand a refund or replacement." Sarah's blood ran cold. Labor contracts. She quickly pulled out her universal translator and adjusted it to ensure she was understanding correctly. The device confirmed her worst fears. They were talking about slavery. "The Vorthak dealer assured us this one would be suitable for mining operations," the first Zelithian said. "Instead, we have this weak specimen that can barely stand properly. Look at those malformed limbs." Sarah looked more closely at the youngling and realized what they meant. The child's left arm was significantly smaller than her right, and she held it close to her body protectively. It was a birth defect, something that made her imperfect in the eyes of these traders. "We cannot return damaged goods to the breeding farms," a third Zelithian merchant interjected. "The cost of transport alone would exceed any potential refund. Perhaps we should simply dispose of it here and claim the loss on our tax returns." The little Vorthak's eyes grew even wider with terror, and she began making soft, whimpering sounds that transcended any language barrier. It was the universal cry of a frightened child. Marcus had been listening too, his young face growing pale. "Mom, they're talking about hurting her, aren't they?" Sarah's hands clenched into fists. She had spent years working as a nurse before her husband's death forced her to take a job in the station's recycling facility to make ends meet. Every instinct she possessed screamed at her to intervene, but she knew the political situation was complex. The Galactic Federation technically allowed certain forms of contractual labor that skirted the edges of slavery, and humans were still considered a minor species with limited influence. "The disposal units are right here," one Zelithian said with cold practicality. "We can register it as defective merchandise. No one will question the loss of a single Vorthak youngling." That was enough. Sarah stepped forward, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Excuse me, but I couldn't help overhearing your conversation." The Zelithians turned to look at her with barely concealed disdain. The largest of them, whose scales bore intricate golden patterns indicating high rank, spoke with a voice like grinding stone. "This does not concern you, human. Return to your menial tasks." "Actually, it does concern me," Sarah replied, pulling out her personal data pad. "I'd like to make an offer for the youngling." The merchants exchanged glances, their reptilian features twisting into what might have been amusement. "You," the golden-scaled one laughed. "What could a lowly human possibly offer? Your species barely has interstellar travel capabilities. You work in waste management, yes? I can smell the recycling chemicals on your clothing." Sarah felt her cheeks burn with humiliation, but she stood her ground. "I have savings. How much do you want for her?" "Her," another Zelithian scoffed. "It is merchandise, human, defective merchandise at that. Even if you could afford the price, what would a primitive species like yours do with a psychic being? Your crude minds cannot even comprehend telepathic communication. The little Vorthak had been watching this exchange with growing hope in her large eyes. She looked up at Sarah with an expression that needed no translation, desperate gratitude mixed with disbelief that someone, anyone, was willing to stand up for her. "Name your price," Sarah insisted, though privately she worried about her meager bank account. Between supporting Marcus and saving for his future education, she barely had enough for emergencies, let alone purchasing a person, even if it meant saving a life. The Zelithians huddled together for a moment, speaking in their native tongue too quickly for the translator to catch. Finally, the golden-scaled leader turned back to her with a cruel smile. "Very well, human. We will humor your pathetic gesture. The original contract was for 50,000 galactic credits. However, since the merchandise is damaged, we will offer it to you for the bargain price of 35,000 credits. Surely even a waste worker can afford such a modest sum." Sarah's heart sank. 35,000 credits was more than she made in 2 years. It was an impossible amount, clearly chosen to humiliate her and demonstrate her powerlessness. She looked down at the little Vorthak, who seemed to understand that her brief moment of hope was about to be crushed. I don't have that much," Sarah admitted quietly. "Of course you don't," the Zelithian said with satisfaction. "Your species is as poor as it is primitive. Now stop wasting our time with your foolish sentimentality. We have business to conduct." They began moving toward the disposal units, one of them roughly grabbing the youngling's good arm. The child cried out in pain and fear, looking back at Sarah with eyes that seemed to say goodbye to the only kindness she had been shown. Sarah's mind raced desperately. There had to be something, some way to help. She thought about calling station security, but she knew they wouldn't intervene in what appeared to be a legal business transaction. The Federation's laws were clear about non-interference in member species' internal affairs, even when those affairs involved slavery. Then Marcus stepped forward, pulling something from his pocket. It was his most prized possession, a small medallion his father had given him before the mining accident. The metal was rare platinum from Earth, formed into an intricate design that represented the family's ancestry. "Mom, what about Dad's platinum?" he whispered. "You said it was worth a lot of money." Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she looked at her son. The medallion was worth perhaps a few hundred credits at most, nothing compared to what the Zelithians demanded. But the gesture spoke volumes about the kind of person Marcus was becoming and the values she had tried to instill in him. She knelt down to Marcus's level, speaking softly. "That's very brave of you, sweetheart, but it's not nearly enough. And that medallion is special. It's all we have left of Daddy." "But Dad always said we should help people when we can," Marcus replied with the simple wisdom of a child. "He wouldn't want us to keep it if someone needed help more than we need to remember him." The Zelithians had stopped to watch this exchange with amusement, clearly enjoying the human's distress. "How touching," the leader said mockingly. "The primitive species displays emotional attachment to worthless trinkets. Perhaps we should charge admission for this entertainment." Sarah stood up slowly, something hardening in her chest. She had been thinking about this all wrong. This wasn't about money or politics or interspecies relations. This was about a frightened child who needed protection, and sometimes protection meant taking risks. "Wait," she called out, her voice stronger now. "I may not have your credits, but I have something else to offer." The Zelithians paused, curiosity overcoming their disdain. And what could that possibly be? Sarah took a deep breath, knowing she was about to gamble everything on a desperate long shot. "Information. I work in recycling, which means I handle waste from every ship and every species that docks here. Do you know what people throw away when they think no one is watching?" The golden-scaled merchant's eyes narrowed with interest despite himself. "Continue." "Evidence," Sarah said simply. "Transaction records, communication logs, shipping manifests. 3 weeks ago, I processed waste from a Zelithian transport vessel. The shipping records showed some very interesting cargo manifests, cargo that I'm betting your tax authorities would find fascinating." It was a complete bluff. Sarah had no idea what specific records might have passed through her processing station, and she certainly hadn't been paying attention to individual manifests. But she had worked with enough bureaucrats and business people to know that everyone had something to hide, especially when it came to taxes and regulatory compliance. The Zelithians exchanged nervous glances. Their reputation for ruthless business practices often meant operating in legal gray areas, and the threat of a tax investigation was serious business in the Federation. "You're bluffing," the leader said, but his voice lacked its previous confidence. "Maybe," Sarah admitted, "but are you willing to take that risk? Station security keeps backups of all processed data. One call from me to the Federation Tax Authority, and they'll be very interested in cross-referencing those records with your filed reports." The standoff stretched for long seconds while the Zelithians considered their options. Sarah could see the calculations running behind their reptilian eyes, the potential cost of an investigation versus the loss they would take on the Youngling. Finally, the leader spoke with barely controlled anger. "Even if we were to consider such an arrangement, your silence would hardly be worth 35,000 credits." "You're right," Sarah agreed. "But it might be worth letting me take the Youngling off your hands for, say, the cost of disposal and paperwork. 500 credits should cover your administrative expenses." It was still more money than Sarah had readily available, but it was an amount she could possibly manage by selling some possessions and borrowing against her next paycheck. The Zelithians huddled again for another conference, their voices rising and falling in heated discussion. The little Vorthak watched all of this with growing confusion and hope. She couldn't understand the human languages being spoken, but she could sense the emotional undercurrents through her natural psychic abilities. The human female's determination felt warm and protective, like sunlight after a long, cold night. "Mom," Marcus whispered, "do you really have information on them?" Sarah squeezed his hand gently. "Sometimes, sweetheart, you have to take big risks to do the right thing. I hope this works, but if it doesn't, we'll find another way." The Zelithian conference finally broke up, and the leader approached with an expression of distaste. "Your species is more cunning than we gave you credit for, human. Very well, 500 credits and your continued silence about any records you may have encountered. But understand this. If you ever attempt to use this information against us, we will crush you and your offspring like insects." Sarah nodded, trying not to show her relief. "Understood. I'll need some time to gather the credits." "You have 1 standard hour," the merchant replied. "After that, we complete our original disposal plan." As the Zelithians moved away to conduct other business, Sarah knelt down next to the little Vorthak youngling. Up close, she could see that the child was even younger than she had first thought, and clearly malnourished. Her silver skin was dull with exhaustion, and the oversized clothing she wore was little more than rough sacking. "Hey there," Sarah said softly, not sure if the youngling could understand her. "My name is Sarah. This is my son Marcus. We're going to help you, okay?" The child's large purple eyes studied Sarah's face intently, and then something remarkable happened. A gentle, tentative voice spoke directly into Sarah's mind, not heard, but felt. "Yous help me, why?" Sarah gasped in surprise. She had read about Vorthak telepathic abilities, but experiencing it firsthand was startling and wonderful. The mental voice was small and frightened, like a whisper from far away. "Because no one should be hurt or thrown away," Sarah replied aloud, hoping the youngling could understand. "Because you're a person, not merchandise." Person, the concept seemed foreign to the child. "I am broken, weak. The sellers said I have no value." "The sellers are wrong," Marcus said firmly, having caught enough of the exchange through his proximity to the telepathic connection. "You're not broken, you're just different, and different can be really cool." For the first time, the youngling's expression showed something other than fear. A tiny smile tugged at the corners of her mouth, and she reached out with her smaller arm to gently touch Marcus's hand. "Your offspring has kind thoughts," she said to Sarah, "like yours. I have never felt such warmth from beings who are not Vorthak." "What's your name, sweetie?" Sarah asked. The child hesitated, then replied both verbally and telepathically, "Zira. My name is Zira." "Zira is a beautiful name," Sarah said. "Zira, I need to go get some money so those mean traders will let you come home with us. Marcus is going to stay here and keep you company, okay? You'll be safe." Sarah looked around the marketplace, her mind racing through possibilities. 500 credits was still a fortune for her, but she had to find a way. Her apartment was furnished with basic items that might have some resale value, and she could probably get an advance on her next paycheck if she explained the emergency to her supervisor. As she prepared to leave on her desperate fundraising mission, Zira's small hand caught her sleeve. Wait, the youngling said telepathically, I can help. What do you mean, honey? Zira's eyes closed in concentration, and suddenly Sarah could sense something extraordinary happening. The child's consciousness reached out psychically, touching the minds of every person in the immediate area. It was like watching someone conduct an invisible orchestra, each note a thought or emotion. The crystal seller, Zira said after a moment. He has kind thoughts about children. He remembers being hungry when he was young. And the food vendor with the 6 arms, she has lost a child and feels sadness when she sees younglings in pain. Sarah realized what Zira was suggesting. You can sense who might be willing to help. The little Vorthak nodded weakly. The psychic effort was clearly exhausting for her malnourished body, but she continued reaching out with her mind. The repair shop owner, he has strong feelings about fairness. And there, the shipping coordinator, she has anger about slavery because her species was once enslaved. Marcus looked up at his mother with excitement. Mom, maybe we don't have to do this alone. Maybe other people will want to help too if they knew what was happening. Sarah felt a surge of hope mixed with determination. Her son was right. She had been thinking too small. This wasn't just about her ability to raise money. This was about giving people the chance to stand up for what was right. Zira, do you think you could help me talk to these people? Help them understand what's happening? The youngling nodded, though she was clearly exhausted from her psychic efforts. I can try, but I am very tired. Then let's do this quickly, Sarah said. Marcus, you stay with Zira. I'm going to see if the good people of this station are willing to prove that kindness isn't limited to any one species. As Sarah hurried toward the crystal vendor's stall, she felt a new kind of determination building inside her. She wasn't just trying to save one frightened child anymore. She was about to test whether the ideals of compassion and justice could overcome the cold calculations of profit and prejudice. The next hour would determine not just Zira's fate, but whether a human single mother's belief in the fundamental goodness of people could stand against the cruelty of an indifferent galaxy. The crystal vendor, an elderly Andromedan with kind, multifaceted eyes, listened intently as Sarah explained the situation. His crystalline appendages chimed softly with emotion as he processed what she was telling him. This youngling reads minds? He asked, his translator rendering his musical language into standard. And she says I have kind thoughts about children. Sarah nodded, glancing back to where Marcus sat protectively next to Zira. The little Vorthak was slumped against a cargo container, her psychic efforts having drained what little energy she had left. She can sense intentions and emotions, Sarah explained. She knew you would understand because you remember being hungry as a child. The Andromedan's crystals darkened with old pain. Yes, my homeworld went through difficult times during the trade wars. Many younglings starved while the wealthy hoarded food. He paused, then began removing credits from his sales pouch. How much do you need? 500 credits total, Sarah said. But I'm not asking anyone to pay everything, even small amounts help. Take 50, the vendor said firmly, pressing the credit chips into her hand. And take this for the youngling. He selected a small, warm, glowing crystal from his display. It responds to emotional states. When she feels safe and loved, it will sing. Perhaps it will help her heal. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. Thank you so much. Her next stop was the food vendor Zira had identified, a hexapod female whose 6 arms worked continuously preparing various dishes for different species. When Sarah approached and began explaining, the vendor's movements slowed and then stopped entirely. Slavery, the hexapod said, her voice flat with old anger. Yes, I know this evil. My people were enslaved by the Dominion Empire for 3 centuries before we won our freedom. All 6 arms trembled with emotion. Show me this child. They walked back to where Zira waited, and the hexapod vendor knelt down to examine the youngling with experienced eyes. She made clicking sounds of distress as she took in Zira's malnourished state and the fear still lingering in her purple eyes. She is starving, the vendor announced. How long since she has eaten proper food? She didn't wait for an answer, instead pulling out a container of nutrient-rich paste designed for young developing minds. Here, little one, slowly, your stomach must remember how to accept nourishment. As Zira ate with desperate hunger, the hexapod vendor turned back to Sarah. I will give 75 credits and I will prepare food for her recovery. No charge, but I want something else. What? Sarah asked, worried about conditions. When this is over, you bring her to my stall every day until she is strong. The other vendors need to see that we do not accept the slavery of children on our station. They need to see her growing healthy and free. Sarah felt her throat tighten with emotion. I promise. The repair shop owner turned out to be a gruff Terran mechanic named Pete who had been working on station for 15 years. When Sarah found him elbow-deep in a shuttle engine and explained the situation, he dropped his tools and cursed creatively in 3 different languages. "Goddamn Zelithian bastards," he growled, wiping his hands on a rag. "They tried to cheat me on a parts contract last month, said humans don't understand quality engineering standards." He pulled out his credit pouch. "How much you got so far?" 125 credits, Sarah said. Pete counted out more credits. "Make it 200. And tell you what, I got a couch in my back office where the kid can sleep tonight if you need time to sort out proper housing. That recycling facility dormitory ain't no place for a traumatized child." The shipping coordinator was a tall, elegant Centaurian female whose usually composed demeanor cracked when she heard Zira's story. Her species had indeed been enslaved in the distant past, and the generational trauma ran deep in their cultural memory. "This cannot stand," she said, her 4 hands clenching into fists. "I will contribute 100 credits, and I will file an official complaint with station administration about the Zelithians' conduct. This may not help today, but it will create a record of their activities." As Sarah moved through the marketplace, word began to spread. Species after species stepped forward with small contributions and offers of help. A Malurian trader donated credits for the sake of all children who suffer. A family of Arcturian tourists gave money after their younglings insisted on helping the sad silver girl. Even some human workers from the lower levels pooled their lunch money. But the most surprising contribution came from an unexpected source. As Sarah was counting her growing collection of credits, she noticed a commotion near the transport hub. A sleek courier ship had docked, and its passenger was creating quite a stir. Admiral Kerrigan of the Terran Defense Force stepped off the transport with the bearing of someone used to command. She was a legend in human space, the first human to achieve flag rank in the Federation Navy, and a war hero from the recent conflicts with the Hegemon Empire. Her presence on the civilian station was highly unusual. "Ma'am," a station security officer approached nervously. "We weren't notified of any official visits." "This isn't official," Admiral Kerrigan replied curtly. "I'm here on personal business." She looked around the marketplace with sharp eyes that missed nothing, then focused on the crowd gathered around Sarah and the children. "What's happening over there?" Word of the situation reached the Admiral through the same network that had been spreading support. A young ensign who happened to be on leave approached her and explained about the human woman trying to rescue a Vorthak child from slavery. Admiral Kerrigan listened without expression, then walked over to where Sarah was kneeling next to Zira, offering her small sips of water while Marcus held the singing crystal the Andromedon had given them. "You're Sarah Chen?" the Admiral asked. Sarah looked up, startled by the authoritative voice. When she saw the uniform and rank insignia, she started to stand, but Admiral Kerrigan gestured for her to remain seated. "Yes, ma'am, I'm sorry, I don't understand why." "Your husband was Michael Chen, wasn't he? Asteroid mining operation in the Belter systems." Sarah's eyes widened with shock. "You knew Mike." "He saved my life during the Hegemon siege of Ceres Station," Admiral Kerrigan said quietly. "Pulled me out of a collapsed tunnel when the artificial gravity failed. I was just a commander then, trapped under debris. Your husband risked his life to dig me out." She paused, looking down at Zira. "I heard about his accident. I should have reached out then, but—" "You don't owe us anything," Sarah said quickly. "Mike did what anyone would do." "No, he didn't. He did what humans do." Admiral Kerrigan pulled out a military credit authorization pad. "How much do you still need?" Sarah checked her count. The outpouring of support had been incredible, but they were still short. "About 50 credits, ma'am, but really you don't have to." Admiral Kerrigan entered an authorization code. "Consider it paid in full, plus an additional 1,000 for the child's medical care and education." She looked directly at Zira, who was staring up at her with wide, awestruck eyes. "No child should be treated as property regardless of species. That's what your father fought for, son," she added to Marcus. As they walked back toward the Zelithian merchants, Sarah felt overwhelmed by what had just happened. In less than an hour, complete strangers from a dozen different species had rallied to help save one small child. It restored her faith in the fundamental goodness that could exist between beings, regardless of their origins. The Zelithians were waiting impatiently when Sarah returned with the credits. Their leader looked surprised that she had actually managed to raise the money, but he was bound by his word. 500 credits, Sarah said, holding out the credit chips. As agreed. The golden-scaled merchant snatched the payment and ran it through a verification scanner. Payment confirmed. The defective merchandise is now your responsibility, human. Do not expect any warranty or return privileges. Sarah knelt down and gently helped Zira to her feet. Come on, sweetheart, let's go home. As they walked away, Zira's telepathic voice whispered in Sarah's mind, Home? I have never had a home. You do now, Sarah replied aloud, not caring who heard her. You absolutely do now. But as they reached the transport platform, Sarah realized that the real challenges were just beginning. She had saved Zira from immediate danger, but now she had to figure out how to actually care for a traumatized alien child with special needs. Her small apartment was barely big enough for herself and Marcus. Her job paid barely enough for basic necessities, and she had no idea what kind of medical care or education a young Vorthak might need. Admiral Kerrigan seemed to read her concerns. Mrs. Chen, might I suggest you contact Dr. Yates at the Diplomatic Quarters Medical Facility? She specializes in xenobiology and has experience with rescued trafficking victims. I'll make sure she knows to expect you. Thank you, Admiral, for everything. Thank your husband, Admiral Kerrigan replied. He taught me that sometimes the most important battles are the ones you fight for people who can't fight for themselves. As the Admiral's transport departed, Sarah found herself standing on the platform with two children looking up at her with complete trust. Marcus reached over and took Zira's good hand in his, and the little Vorthak smiled genuinely for the first time since Sarah had met her. I can feel your worry, Zira said telepathically, about food and space and money. But I can also feel your love. It is the most beautiful thing I have ever experienced. Sarah felt tears running down her cheeks. We'll figure it out, honey. We'll figure it all out. But even as she said it, she wondered if love would be enough to overcome all the practical challenges ahead. Zira needed medical care, legal documentation, education, and emotional support that Sarah wasn't sure she could provide. The little Vorthak had been rescued from one terrible situation, but her future was still far from certain. As they boarded the transport to head home, Sarah made a silent promise to herself and to the alien child now under her protection. Whatever it took, however hard it might be, she would make sure Zira had the chance to grow up safe, healthy, and free. The galaxy had already shown today that there were more good people than bad ones. Now she had to trust that the same universe that had brought Zira into her life would provide the means to care for her properly. The transport lifted off, carrying a human single mother, her son, and their new alien daughter toward an uncertain but hopeful future. Behind them, the marketplace continued its bustling activity, but something had changed. Word was spreading throughout the station about what had happened, about how beings from different worlds had come together to save one small life. And in the depths of space, on ships and stations throughout the sector, people were beginning to ask questions about the Zelithians' business practices and the tolerance for slavery that still existed in the supposedly civilized galaxy. Sarah didn't know it yet, but her simple act of compassion was about to have consequences that would ripple far beyond one space station. The rescue of a single Vorthak youngling was about to become the catalyst for something much larger, a movement that would challenge the very foundations of how the galaxy treated its most vulnerable citizens. But for now, all that mattered was the small silver hand nestled trustingly in hers, and the knowledge that sometimes, when good people decide to act, miracles really can happen. 6 months later, Sarah Chen stood in the courtroom of the Galactic Federation's Regional Justice Center, her hand resting protectively on Zira's shoulder. The little Vorthak had grown noticeably healthier during her time with the Chen family. Her silver skin now gleamed with proper nutrition, and her purple eyes sparkled with intelligence and joy rather than fear. The transformation had not been easy. Those first weeks had been filled with nightmares, medical appointments, and the complex bureaucracy of trying to legally adopt an alien child. Dr. Yates had diagnosed Zira with severe malnutrition, chronic stress injuries, and psychological trauma that would require ongoing therapy. But she had also discovered something remarkable. Zira's psychic abilities were far stronger than typical for her species, likely enhanced by the survival mechanisms she had developed during her captivity. The court recognizes Sarah Chen and her petition for formal adoption of the minor Zira of Vorthak Prime, announced Judge Administrator Vex, a stern crystalline being whose faceted form reflected the courtroom lights. This case has attracted considerable attention throughout Federation space. That was an understatement. What had started as one woman's act of compassion had snowballed into something much larger. Admiral Kerrigan had kept her word and made some discreet inquiries about the Zelithian merchants. Those inquiries had uncovered a vast network of illegal trafficking operations that stretched across multiple systems. The hexapod food vendor had also been true to her promise. Every day for 6 months, she had prepared special meals for Zira's recovery, refusing any payment. More importantly, she had made sure other vendors and station residents could see the young Vorthak growing healthy and happy. The daily sight of Zira playing with Marcus, helping Sarah with small tasks, and gradually learning to trust the world around her had profoundly affected the entire station community. "Your Honor," said the court advocate representing Sarah, "the evidence clearly shows that Ms. Chen has provided exemplary care for the minor Zira. Medical reports indicate complete physical recovery, psychological evaluations show remarkable progress in overcoming trauma, and educational assessments reveal that Zira is not only learning human languages and customs, but is also excelling in mathematics and spatial reasoning." Judge Vex consulted the data files floating before his crystalline form. The court notes that this case has raised significant legal questions about interspecies adoption rights and the protection of trafficking victims. We have received statements supporting the adoption from 14 different species representatives, including a formal endorsement from the Vorthak Embassy. Sarah's heart raced. The Vorthak Embassy's involvement had been the wild card in this entire process. When word of Zira's rescue had reached Vorthak Prime, the response had been swift and surprising. A delegation had arrived on station 3 months ago to investigate the circumstances of Zira's trafficking. Ambassador Thulnara, an elderly Vorthak male with intricate silver markings indicating his high rank, had spent hours with Zira, communicating through the complex telepathic language of their species. Sarah had been terrified that they would want to take Zira back to their homeworld, away from the only family she had ever known. "The Vorthak delegation's report makes interesting reading," Judge Vex continued. Ambassador Thulnara notes that young Zira's psychic development has progressed remarkably under human care. Quote, "The human family has provided not only physical safety but emotional stability that has allowed the youngling's natural abilities to flourish. Her telepathic range and clarity have increased dramatically, and she has developed empathic skills that are rare even among our people." Zira squeezed Sarah's hand and looked up at her with a small smile. Over the months, their bond had deepened beyond anything Sarah had thought possible. The little girl's telepathic abilities meant that they could communicate on levels that went far beyond words. Sarah could sense Zira's emotions and needs almost instinctively, while Zira had become incredibly attuned to the feelings and moods of her new family. Marcus had adapted to having an alien sister with the remarkable flexibility of childhood. He had learned to include Zira in their mental conversations, and the two children had developed a unique friendship that bridged not just species, but entire ways of thinking and perceiving the world. "However," Judge Vex said, his tone becoming more serious, "this case has also exposed significant issues within our legal framework. The court has received several challenges to these proceedings." A new voice spoke from the back of the courtroom. "Your Honor, the Zelithian Trade Consortium wishes to formally object to these proceedings." Sarah's blood chilled as she recognized the golden-scaled Zelithian who had originally tried to dispose of Zira. He was flanked by several other merchants and what appeared to be a high-ranking legal advocate. "Consortium Representative Vexter," Judge Vex acknowledged, "state your objection." The Zelithian stepped forward with arrogant confidence. "Your Honor, this entire proceeding is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of contractual law. The human Sarah Chen did not purchase the Vorthak specimen through proper legal channels. She obtained possession through what amounts to extortion and threats." Sarah felt Zira tense beside her. Even after months of safety and love, the sight of her former captors still triggered deep anxiety in the child. "Furthermore," Vexter continued, The Zelithian Trade Consortium maintains that any adoption proceedings are invalid because the specimen in question remains our legal property. Ms. Chen's payment covered disposal and administrative fees only, not transfer of ownership. The courtroom erupted in angry murmurs from the observers. Over the months, Zira's story had spread throughout Federation space, and public opinion had turned strongly against the Zelithians' business practices. Judge Vex called for order. The court will hear the consortium's legal argument, but I remind all parties that we are discussing a sentient being, not property. Vexter's advocate, a cold-eyed algorithmic being whose mechanical voice carried no emotion, began presenting their case. Honored Judge, Federation law clearly states that contractual obligations between member species must be honored regardless of personal sentiment. The Zelithian Trade Consortium entered into a legal purchase agreement for the Vorthak specimen. That contract remains valid regardless of the specimen's current location. Sarah's advocate immediately stood to respond. Your Honor, Federation law also clearly states that no sentient being can be held as property. The Universal Rights Charter, ratified by all member species including the Zelithians, explicitly prohibits slavery and trafficking. The consortium's activities fall under the contractual labor statutes, the algorithmic advocate countered. These allow for work contracts with beings of limited capacity. Defective specimens who cannot fulfill their contractual obligations revert to consortium property for proper disposal. She's not defective, Marcus burst out from his seat, his young voice carrying clearly through the courtroom. She's the smartest person I know. She can do math in her head faster than our computer, and she's teaching me how to sense what people are feeling. Judge Vex looked down at the 8-year-old boy with what might have been amusement. Young human, this court appreciates your testimony, but please allow the advocates to present their arguments. Sarah placed a calming hand on Marcus's shoulder, but privately she was proud of her son's fierce protectiveness of his sister. Over the months, the two children had become inseparable. Marcus had learned to sign for when Zira was too tired for telepathy, while Zira had used her empathic abilities to help Marcus deal with his own grief over his father's death. The algorithmic advocate continued his cold recitation of legal precedents and contractual obligations. But as he spoke, something interesting began to happen. Zira, who had been sitting quietly beside Sarah, started to concentrate with the same intense focus she had shown in the marketplace 6 months ago. Her psychic abilities had indeed grown remarkably during her recovery. Dr. Yates had theorized that the combination of proper nutrition, emotional security, and the stimulating environment of human society had allowed Zira's natural talents to develop beyond normal parameters for her species. Now Zira was using those abilities to reach out psychically to every person in the courtroom, sharing not words or images, but pure emotion, the terror and despair she had felt when the Zelithians were planning to dispose of her, followed by the overwhelming joy and love she had experienced with her human family. The effect was dramatic. Throughout the courtroom, beings from a dozen different species suddenly found themselves experiencing Zira's memories firsthand. They felt her fear, her loneliness, her gratitude, and her fierce love for the family that had saved her. Several observers began to cry. The court stenographer, a usually emotionless cybernetic unit, made sounds that suggested its emotional processing subroutines were overloading. Even Judge Vex's crystalline form seemed to dim with sympathy. Your Honor, Sarah's advocate said, recognizing the opportunity, I believe the court has just experienced more relevant testimony than any legal document could provide. This child is not property or a specimen. She is a person with thoughts, feelings, hopes, and dreams. She has chosen her family just as they have chosen her. The algorithmic advocate seemed unaffected by Zira's psychic display. Emotional manipulation does not change legal precedent, Your Honor. The consortium maintains its ownership rights regardless of the specimen's mental state. But Vexter, the golden-scaled Zelithian, was backing away from Zira with obvious distress. Like most beings in the courtroom, he had experienced her psychic sharing, and for the first time he was confronting the reality of what he had been willing to do to a frightened child. Your Honor, a new voice interrupted from the gallery. Admiral Kerrigan stood up from where she had been quietly observing the proceedings. If the court permits, I have new evidence that may be relevant to this case. Judge Vex consulted his data systems. Admiral Kerrigan, you are not listed as a party to these proceedings. No, Your Honor, but as a representative of the Terran Defense Force, I have been investigating the broader implications of this case. 3 months ago, we raided a Zelithian trafficking facility in the Outer Rim. What we found has changed everything. Admiral Kerrigan activated a holographic display that filled the center of the courtroom. The images showed a vast underground facility with hundreds of holding cells, each containing young beings from various species. The conditions were horrific, overcrowded, unsanitary, and clearly designed for beings considered to be nothing more than livestock. We discovered over 3,000 youngling slaves in this one facility alone, Admiral Kerrigan continued. Many were injured, sick, or had birth defects that made them unsuitable for heavy labor. The consortium's solution was mass disposal in industrial furnaces. Gasps and cries of horror filled the courtroom. Even the algorithmic advocate seemed to pause in his legal recitations as the full scope of the Zelithian operations became clear. Furthermore, Admiral Kerrigan said, our investigation revealed that the contractual labor statutes that the consortium claims to operate under were obtained through falsified documentation and bribery of Federation officials. The contracts themselves are completely illegal under both Federation law and the laws of every homeworld from which these younglings were taken. Vexter and his associates were now backing toward the courtroom exits, but station security had quietly moved to block their escape routes. What had started as a simple adoption hearing had become something much more significant. Judge Vex consulted rapidly with his legal databases, his crystalline form flickering through various colors as he processed the new information. In light of these revelations, this court declares an immediate recess while we review all evidence and coordinate with Federation law enforcement. As the formal proceedings paused, something wonderful happened in the courtroom. Beings from different species began approaching Sarah, Zira, and Marcus, offering congratulations, support, and shared stories of their own experiences with adoption and family. The elderly Andromedon crystal vendor was there, along with the hexapod food vendor who had become like a grandmother to Zira. Pete the mechanic had closed his repair shop to attend, and dozens of other station residents who had helped with the original rescue were present to show their support. But the most significant moment came when Ambassador Thulnara approached the Chen family. The elderly Vorthak's telepathic voice reached all three of them simultaneously. Young Zira, he said, your growth among these humans has been remarkable to observe. You have become something new, not fully Vorthak, not fully human, but something that bridges both worlds. Your psychic abilities combined with human emotional intelligence create possibilities we never imagined. Zira looked up at the ambassador with respect but no longer with the desperate need for approval she had once shown around her own species. I am grateful to you and our people, she replied telepathically. But these humans are my family. This is where I belong. Yes, Ambassador Thulnara agreed, which is why the Vorthak Council has decided to take an unprecedented step. We are formally requesting that the Federation establish new protocols for interspecies adoption and the protection of trafficked younglings. Your case will become the legal foundation that protects thousands of other children. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she realized the full implications of what they had accomplished. What had started as one desperate mother's attempt to save a single child had grown into something that would change Federation law and save countless other lives. When court reconvened 2 hours later, Judge Vex's announcement was swift and definitive. After reviewing all evidence, this court finds that the Zelithian Trade Consortium's claims have no legal merit. The so-called contracts under which they operated were obtained illegally and violate fundamental Federation principles. He turned to Sarah and her family. Furthermore, this court finds that the adoption petition meets all legal requirements and serves the best interests of the child in question. Sarah Chen, you are hereby granted full legal custody and parental rights for Zira of Vorthak Prime, who shall henceforth be known as Zira Chen if she so chooses. The courtroom erupted in cheers and applause. Zira threw her arms around Sarah in a fierce hug, her telepathic voice singing with joy in the minds of everyone present. But Judge Vex wasn't finished. Additionally, this court is ordering the immediate arrest of all Zelithian Trade Consortium representatives present today on charges of trafficking, slavery, and conspiracy. Admiral Kerrigan, You have the full cooperation of this court in your ongoing investigation. As station security moved to arrest the Zelithians, Vexter caught Sarah's eye. For just a moment, she saw something in his expression that might have been regret or recognition of the horror he had been part of. But it was too late for redemption. Too many children had suffered and died because of his greed. Outside the courthouse, the Chen family was surrounded by well-wishers and reporters from across the Federation. The story of the human single mother who had stood up to galactic slavery was spreading rapidly, inspiring similar acts of courage throughout civilized space. "Mrs. Chen," a Rigelian journalist called out, "what do you want people to take away from this experience?" Sarah looked down at Zira, who was holding Marcus's hand and smiling with pure happiness. "I want them to know that family isn't about what species you are or where you come from. It's about love, protection, and giving everyone the chance to become the best version of themselves. And I want them to know," Zira added telepathically, her mental voice now strong enough to reach the entire crowd, "that even the smallest acts of kindness can change everything. My human mother saw me when everyone else saw only damaged property. She gave me a name, a family, and a future." 6 months later, Sarah received a message that made her smile with deep satisfaction. The Federation had passed the Zira Protocols, comprehensive new laws that strengthened protections for trafficking victims, established universal standards for interspecies adoption, and created severe penalties for those who treated sentient beings as property. More importantly, Admiral Kerrigan's task force had rescued over 15,000 enslaved younglings from consortium facilities across the galaxy. Many of them were now being placed with loving families of various species, following the model that the Chen family had established. Zira, now 9 years old and fluent in 4 languages plus her native telepathy, had become something of a celebrity in Federation space. But she was also, most importantly, exactly what Sarah had promised she could be, a happy, healthy child with a bright future ahead of her. That evening, as Sarah tucked her 2 children into bed, Zira reached out with her mind one more time. "Thank you," she said simply, "for seeing me as a person worth saving." "Thank you," Sarah replied, "for teaching us that the best families are the ones you choose with your heart." As Sarah turned off the lights and headed to her own room, she reflected on how much their lives had changed since that day in the marketplace. They still lived in the same small apartment, she still worked at the recycling facility, and money was still tight. But they had something more valuable than wealth or status. They had each other, and they had the knowledge that their love had literally changed the galaxy. Outside their window, the stars shone with the light of 1,000 worlds where freedom was a little more secure, because one human mother had decided that no child should ever be thrown away. And on station, in a dozen different languages, parents told their younglings bedtime stories about the brave humans who proved that family is bigger than species, and love is stronger than hate. The galaxy was vast and often cruel, but it was also full of people willing to fight for what was right. And sometimes, when good people decided to act, they could indeed change everything.